So I'm delighted on behalf of Ruskin's Guild to welcome you this evening for this talk very kindly being given for us by Companion of the Guild, Roy Starkey, who, rather more importantly than his companionship, is a great expert on minerals.
Oh,
And
don't overdo
as
it,
you're,
Simon.
well, I don't want to big you up too much, but I believe that's fair thing to say. Um, and has written a new book on the mineral world of John Ruskin. And so this felt like a very timely moment to ask Roy if he'd be willing to give a talk for the Guild, which we are recording so that it can then be a freely available asset of interest and educational value on the Guild website, as we do with all our events. Um, my suggestion will be that everyone other than Roy mutes themselves, just so that if there are domestic noises, cats and dogs and telephones and doorbells and so on, that they don't disturb Roy and the recording. And then, Roy, as I understand it, at the end, you'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And I suggest people pop any comments or questions in the chat, and then we can just work through that.
great,
If they're all
excellent. So
comfortable
yes,
doing that.
do
Yeah.
do use the chat function if you'd like to register a question or anything else, and then we can gather and Roy can respond. But without further ado, Roy, over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Simon. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for turning up. I hope this is going to be interesting. I can promise you it's going to be different to most of the talks you will have heard about John Ruskin, because as far as I can ascertain, no one has ever really looked at his mineralogical interests before, and that really surprised me when I set out on the project to start with. So we'll try sharing the screen and get some slides going. So, okay, hopefully you can see the title slide. So I think I've noticed that it's quite often the case that people like to say something about how they came to Ruskin. I've seen this online on various of the blogs. And the way that I came to Ruskin was because I had been working on a book about a guy called Sir Arthur Russell. And Sir Arthur Russell is perhaps our greatest mineral collector in the UK. And he made it his business to research and track down many old collections. And as a result of that, he was able to assimilate those collections into his own very fine collection, which he then bequeathed on his death in 1964 to the Natural History Museum in London. And as a result of that, one of the people that I investigated was John Ruskin. It took me to Brantwood. I met Howard. I got rather interested in the story and the nature of the collection. And I made a mental note that it might be an interesting subject for another project at some point. So, long story short, I went back to see Howard once the Russell book was out of the way and said, I'm thinking of writing something about Ruskin and his minerals. Would you be interested? Would you be happy to cooperate? And the answer was a resounding yes. So that is how we got to where we are today. Now, given that this is being recorded and therefore there will be people that know little or nothing about Ruskin, I'm going to just run through very briefly a potted biography. So apologies to those of you that know this already. And if you spot any gross errors, just please sit quietly, tell me later. So who was John Ruskin? Well, we all realise that he was one of these Victorian polymaths, and he sits alongside people like Darwin and the like. And I am in awe of these people. Whenever you start looking at them and think what they achieved and the people, the reservoirs in Wales for the water supply to Birmingham and so on, you think, gosh, how did these people get all this stuff done in the time that was available to them? And he was obviously influential in a broad swathe of life, art, literature, social reform, writing his own stuff, painting. But also he was involved as a geologist, an amateur geologist necessarily, a botanist, alpinist, and not really quite a mountaineer, but he did some fairly serious hikes. And he really championed natural beauty and, of course, ethical craftsmanship. And we might think of the lace industry in the Lake District and other sort of pursuits that he was a patron of. But more so, he looked at the natural world very much with the eye of an artist. And I think when you look at modern painters, and I'm guessing many of you will have read Modern Painters, I've skimmed it. I did actually skim all 5 volumes. It's a really interesting read when you dig into the detail. And so if you put all that together, he was also very well connected and in regular contact with people like scientists and philosophers, people of literature, people in the art world. And therefore, he had a very interesting life. Balancing that slightly upbeat, positive review, I would say that my impression, and I'm not a Ruskin scholar, is that I would characterize him as being controversial, opinionated, outspoken, but always questioning. And indeed, he's on record as saying that he preferred not to lecture, but to teach by questioning people. And it's undoubtedly true to say that his ideas and his influence are still felt today. And therefore, there is still quite a strong sustaining interest in Ruskin. And the 200th anniversary of his birth a few years ago really put him back in the spotlight and attracted a lot of fairly positive media attention. So very briefly, he was born in London. He was very fortunate to have a wealthy father. His father made his money through being a wine merchant, and specifically as being the country manager for Domecq Sherry. And I was amused to see that this bottle on the right here was sold at auction recently for £1,600, 1894. Whether the purchaser would be brave enough to open it, I don't know, or whether he just put it in his bank vault, but they are still around apparently. And as a consequence of his dad being essentially a commercial traveller, I suppose, in modern speak, he would travel around the country visiting agents, warehouses, stockists, large customers. So you can imagine stately homes, say places like Chatsworth, for example, and some of the castles, Alnwick Castle, places like that. And so he was able to observe, fine living, very well-to-do people, and rather fine architectural buildings. And so I think there's little doubt that that will have helped to kindle his interest in art and architecture and so on. Now, another really major interest, which will be apparent to those of you that follow art, is his association with Turner. And this is reportedly due to him having received a copy of Samuel Rogers' sort of epic poem book, Italy, which is here. And the illustrations for that had been commissioned for Turner to provide illustrations. And here's an example, very nice drawings. And he reportedly was really besotted with Turner's work. And that really was the beginning of that relationship and him becoming a strong proponent of Turner's work. So that's the world that most of you will be familiar with. There was another largely hidden world, which I think dominated Ruskin's life, and it was ever present. Sometimes it was suppressed by other things, but he was intensely interested in minerals. And I think when you look at this specimen here, he was interested in the diversity of colour, the texture, the form, the crystallography, why red and green minerals occur together or didn't occur together, and whether the red mineral was dominant over the green mineral. And he described all this in characteristically sort of verbose purple prose. And he was really the master of that sort of description. And when you look at his correspondence with all manner of people, quite often there will just be a single line in a letter which is nothing to do with minerals. And he will say, I am once again at minerals, or I have had a good day at minerals, or something like that. Obviously assuming that the recipient was interested to know that he was interested in minerals. And the thing that really becomes clear when you start to chart his life and the sort of the personal turmoil of failed marriage and so on, and deaths in the family, that when times got tough, Ruskin turned to his minerals. And I think it's true to say that these things became his sanctuary in times of distress. And this is a cycle that was repeated over and over again as he battled the mental illness that plagued it. Now, mountains and minerals go together in many ways, and the Lake District, of course, we think of Brantwood whenever you think of John Ruskin, and his parents took him to took him to the Lake District very early in life, and this is probably one of the most frequently quoted little passages, and it's him talking about standing on this little promontory here on Derwentwater, which is called Friar's Crag, looking down into the tree roots and the moss. And that's the quote. I'm not going to read it to you. You can just skim that through. And so that had a really big influence on Ruskin. And I think it was the beginning of his love affair with the Lake District. Now, for the people in the UK, and obviously ultimately there will be people from overseas possibly listening to the recording, this is what we know as the Lake District, principally Cumbria, and the county boundaries change periodically. So here it shows Cumberland, Westmorland and Furness, Lancaster in Lancashire down the bottom. But this is essentially an area of dissected high ground with a number of lakes running out radially from the centre. And Derwentwater is here, up near Keswick, and due south of that roughly is Brantwood, which became his home in later life on the east shore of Coniston Water. So it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's a national park, something I'm sure Ruskin would have approved of, and it's a very popular area for holidays and tourism. Now, allied to mountains, one immediately starts to think of rocks, and rocks to geology. And Ruskin pursued geology as a casual interest for many years from a very young age. And because he was afforded the opportunity to travel in the UK and to travel in Europe, he was able to see a wide diversity of landscapes, and he became very interested in trying to understand what he could see, particularly if he could see folds and faults and inclined strata. He wanted to understand and know why and how this had formed. And so the plate on the right is from Deucalion, and these are his pie paste experiments. And as I interpret this, this is basically pastry that has been laid out in layers with jam spread between it and then sort of pressed into a sandwich block. And then he's pushed that in a compressive mode. And you can see here there's a wooden block against which this is being pushed. And he's crumpling the layers exactly as you would see in fold mountains. So that's really quite interesting that he was sufficiently, well, first of all, committed and technically minded to think of doing that, and then to record it and to draw it and to print it and publish it. So all of this, for someone that really had no fundamental training in that world. Now, along the way, he was able to meet a lot of interesting people, and he developed relationships in Switzerland and France with mountaineers and geologists. He knew Forbes, the glaciologist, many university academics and museum staff. And most notably, these would have been at the British Museum, which is what is later called the British Museum Natural History down at South Kensington, and it's now been rebranded as the Natural History Museum London. And so he was able to rub shoulders with very important and learned people at that time. Now, if we go to the library edition of the complete works, the frontispiece to Deucalion has this rather fine colour plate, and this is the printed plate, and this is taken from a drawing of this original specimen of opal from Australia. And quite how that came to be, I think, the only colour plate, I'm not sure, but clearly it was a later edition. It wouldn't have been something that would have been in the early editions when Ruskin produced it to start with. So to go back to the Lake District, Skiddaw was one of his favourite mountains. And here we have Derwentwater, Skiddaw in the distance with the clouds on. And this was somewhere that he had a great affection for. He went up several times. First of all, when he was quite young with his parents, and latterly went up with Effie. I have joked at the end of the book that perhaps we should have an anniversary revisit. I'll come back to that later on. Now, the other area of mountains that really one associates with Ruskin is the Alps, and specifically the area around Chamonix. And the business of getting there in the mid-1800s is really quite a major undertaking. You would have got a ferry across the channel. You would then possibly have got a train maybe as far as Paris, depending on when you were going. And then it would have been a question of mail coaches and changing horses, every however many miles the horses can do, staying in an inn for a couple of nights. And as you got further and further south into the mountains, then the going got tougher and tougher. And ultimately, you might well have been on a mule or a pony or in some particularly durable sort of cart. As time passed, it became a less onerous business, but it's 560 miles from the Channel coast down to Chamonix. So something that he did about 20 times in his lifetime in the mid-1800s. Quite remarkable. He really wanted to get there. And the reason that he wanted to get there was the stunning scenery. This is Mont Blanc. This is the Chamonix Valley. And this was one of his two favourite places in the world, the other one being Venice. And just out of shot, coming up in a minute, will be the Mer de Glace Glacier. These are the aiguilles, or the needles, the jagged ridges, which he sketched and painted. And just here, this is the aiguille de Midi, which I'll come back to in a moment. But you can understand why he was in awe of the mountains, and he was entrusted to the care of a chap called Joseph Marie Coutet, who was widely sort of considered to be one of the best mountaineers and guides of his era, and he had been up Mont Blanc several times. And this is the Mer de Glace glacier, and again, possibly one of Ruskin's most famous sort of images is this very early daguerreotype. So the daguerreotype was an early form of photography, and it was really the first form of photography that was made available to the well-heeled public. It was an expensive business, but you only got one copy. You didn't get a negative. It wasn't possible to reproduce the plate. It was directly exposed onto a silver coated copper plate. But this is the Mer de Glace, taken in the mid 1800s. And this is roughly the same view. So if you can see that shadowy slope coming in there, that's this shadowy slope here, and this left-hand side of the valley is here. And the ice would have been up to here. And it was, tens of meters deep, all the way down to the valley floor below. And it has receded out of sight. And Ruskin was very conscious of this, that he was conscious that it was retreating. And it's gone back about 2 kilometers since his time, most notably 400 meters in the last 20 years. So in addition to his storm cloud work, his observations on glaciers, it is considered that he was an early exponent of the onset of climate change. But this is the sort of terrain that he was interested in hiking and walking in. He wouldn't have got up to the top of these peaks, but Coutet took him on some pretty exciting scrambles. And I'm stood at the top of the Aiguille de Midi, and this is the arête that most people descend from the top of the chairlift. And that's a pretty hairy exercise because it's a long, long way down to the valley floor. I'll just show you, this is the distant shot. So this is the slope that those people are walking down. And if you go down there, you're not going to stop. Now, Ruskin didn't do anything quite as daring as that, but he would have been very interested to see the developments that have taken place, I think, in alpinism and in tourism. Now, one of the things which the Chamonix area, Mont Blanc in particular, is famous for is pink fluorite. Fluorite is calcium fluoride. It's this mineral here. And generally speaking, it would be blue or pale coloured, maybe green, yellow. Very rarely pink, and the Alps produce these rather nice rose pink crystals. And for Ruskin to acquire these back in 1850 or thereabouts would have been a considerable investment. He purchased these from Coutet, and he then decided to give them to the British Museum. And I don't really know why that happened. And it appears that he gave one and then he gave the other because there's a time delay in the accession record. And part of the deal was to have this little label put with them, and he insisted that this should always be kept with the specimens. And he says he presented it to the museum in honour of his friend Joseph Coutet, the last captain of Mont Blanc, by whom they were found. And these are still in good condition. They are kept behind the scenes at the Natural History Museum, and one of those will be coming up to Brantwood for the exhibition. Now, the other thing that mineral collectors and crystal hunters go looking for in the Alps is smoky quartz. And this is called a gwindle. And you can probably see that the crystals are offset. They're sort of stepped, slightly like a very gradual curved spiral staircase. And this is a particular sort of growth that occurs in the Alps. And this is a very nice example. It's about 2 inches square, roughly. And I'll draw your attention to this little label here, 49 over R, like a fraction. And this is one of his very last labels. We'll come back to labels and curation later on. So this is one of the last things that Ruskin stuck a number on before he died. So interesting that this one was attracting his attention at that time. The other thing which surprised me, and I hope may surprise you, is that Ruskin is held in considerable esteem to this day in the Chamonix Valley. There are people there who still talk about him, lecture about him, study him. And one of the things that came to light, and I made 2 trips to Chamonix in terms of research for the project, is that this is Ruskin's boulder. And reportedly, he used to like to sit on the top of this after dinner in the early evening when he was in Chamonix and look up to Mont Blanc as the sun was setting. And it was decided to mark this by putting this bronze medallion. This was established and inaugurated in 1925. And there was quite a ceremony, and this is well documented. And the mayor and the rector of the university were officiating. And if you're interested, this is Chamonix town centre. This is the cable car that takes you to the top of the Brevent, which is somewhere else that he was very fond of. And this is the location of the boulder, the Pierre, a Ruskin Pierre being a rock or a stone. And it occurred to me that in 2025, it was going to be 100 years since this had been inaugurated. And so I contacted some of the people in Chamonix and said, are you aware of this and do you plan to do anything about it? And if not, I think it would be a good idea if you did. And to my great delight, they picked it up and really ran with some enthusiasm. And they organised a rededication ceremony at the boulder. And they had a seminar with 4 eminent Ruskin scholars in France and light refreshments and so on. So that was quite a nice spin-off from the project. Now, a little further north of Chamonix is this place, Mornay. I believe that's how it's pronounced. They pronounce the X. And this was somewhere that he stayed. He very much liked the view. And this is the room that Ruskin had, the one with the balcony. He was in good company because a few years before he stayed there, Richard Wagner stayed there, he of the Ride of the Valkyries, which has been used a lot in films, some of you will know, perhaps most notably with Apocalypse Now, with the helicopters zooming in. But anyway, that's a bit of a digression. But Wagner and Ruskin both stayed in this room. And I had hoped to get access to the property and to go inside. Unfortunately, the people that own it were away. They use it as a holiday cottage. So I had to make do with taking a picture from near here, looking out. But this is the view that he would have enjoyed. So that's the summit of Mont Blanc on a clear day. On the other side of the Alps, and all of this, of course, is relative to his geology and his mountain building interest and so on. He was very at home in the mountain environment. And with Coutet as a guide, he was not going to come to any great harm. So this is on the Italian side of the Alps. We're below the Rosa Massif up here. So these are all 4,000-meter peaks just peeking out of the cloud. And it's a delightful little village called Macagnara. And this is at the head of the Anzasca Valley. And if you've never been there, again, it's a very nice place to go. You can do Chamonix and this in one trip. And he stayed, when he was here, he stayed for a month in a chalet that would have looked very much like one of these. It is indeed possible that one of these is the chalet he stayed in. It was near this church. And the reason he stayed there for a month was he'd arranged for his post to be forwarded there. And again, these Victorians, can you imagine trying to do that today? The hope that your post would be forwarded to Macagnara village and to find you. So he was very organised in his expedition planning. And so we then come to 1900. He's lived to a ripe old age, and all things come to an end. And he was buried in Coniston Churchyard, St Andrew's Church. This very nice cross designed by Collingwood, executed in Tilbrathwaite slate from just up the road from Coniston. And fittingly, these other rather plainer crosses are the graves of Joan and Arthur Severn, who obviously were his carers in later life, and their daughter Lily, and his great friends, the botanical illustrators, Mary and Susan Beaver. So we've got the whole clutch there. And again, if you've never been, it's quite an interesting place to go and sit and ponder and think about these people. Now, in terms of his legacy, most people will think of his written output and his sketches and his paintings and so on. And of course, you have the complete works, the library edition, a pretty significant investment if you want one nowadays. We have the Ruskin Museum at Coniston and the memorial at Poets' Corner. But we're going to go on now and really talk about his other legacy, and that is his mineralogical collections. And many people have picked up that he was given a little box set of minerals by his father when he was a young lad. It was purchased from a man who had a museum. So for museum, read museum and shop, natural history sort of items for sale in Keswick, Daniel Crosswaite. And unfortunately, the actual specimen set that Ruskin was given seems to have gone missing. I've not come across anyone who's even seen a record of it having been found, so long since gone. But it would have looked something like this. It was a very modest set, and this is the sort of thing that was quite commonly put together in Victorian times, quite collectible now. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that he had links with the British Museum, and first up in terms of looking at his mineralogical exploits, it is the British Museum. And this rather fine photograph is half of a stereo pair, and this shadowy figure over here is the keeper of mineralogy, Story masculine, And this other figure stood sort of erect at the doorway with his staff is the museum attendant. And his job, had you gone into the gallery, he would have pointed out with his staff objects of interest that you might be interested in. Now, shortly after he became involved with this, the museum decided that there was going to be a new museum of natural history, and that was put before Parliament. Funding was granted, and what we now know as the Natural History Museum was constructed in South Kensington. And just at the cusp of the transfer of the mineral collection to South Kensington, in comes Lazarus Fletcher, who was a towering figure in the field of mineralogy and indeed in the Natural History Museum. And he was the keeper of mineralogy who succeeded Story Maskelyne, and he eventually became the director of the whole museum. So he's something of a hero, and he was someone that Ruskin knew well. So enter the next surprise. In 1861, Ruskin starts giving specimens to the National Collection. So he has got specimens that are not only attractive to him and of good quality, but they're of significant enough nature that the National Collection was interested in having them gifted. And so here's a very fine specimen from the Alps somewhere. The golden needles are titanium oxide, rutile in quartz. And that's about 8 inches across, so it's a really quite a fine thing. And here are 3 other specimens given by him in 1863 and 1865. The 2 on the left are on display in the Mineral Gallery. And again, once I started digging into this, I was just astounded. I had no idea, A, that there were John Ruskin specimens on display, or B, that there were quite as many of them, as is the case. And this blue one, azurite from Chessy in France, this is on display in one of the rather dark portholes in the former Geological Museum building, which is now part of the NHM, in the big atrium with the escalator going up. This specimen here is an interesting piece. This is from Cornwall, and here we have a mineral called galena, lead sulfide, which is replacing and assuming the shape of a former mineral, pyromorphite, a lead phosphate. And on the right here, this is a really impressive specimen. It's almost 1 meter tall. It's a significantly heavy item. It's solid copper metal from Lake Superior in the States. And this one's actually recently gone on display, partly as a result of the project, because it sort of drew it to the attention of Mike Rumsey, the curator there. And when they did the revamp of the vault, which is the special exhibition gallery at the end of the Mineral Gallery, it was decided to put this in. Unfortunately, it's lying down rather than vertical, but it's still an impressive item nonetheless. So where did Ruskin get his specimens from? He wasn't really much of a field collector, and he was buying from the leading suppliers of the day. So first up here, Richard Talling, a towering figure in the world of Cornish mineralogy. He was one of the major suppliers to all of the great collectors of the day. And Ruskin was particularly interested in quartz and its variants, so agates, chalcedony, jaspers, and so on. And so here we have 3 specimens, all very different in form, all provided by Richard Talling to John Ruskin, and then subsequently acquired by Sir Arthur Russell, who I mentioned, and we'll come back to Russell later on. Another suite of specimens from Richard Talling, very desirable. This is called ruby copper. It's chalcotrichite, so it's like tiny needles, a little bit thicker than a hair perhaps, and they form mats and aggregated masses of copper oxide. And Ruskin was very fond of this, and there are several mentions in the correspondence between him and Richard Talling to say these are exquisite, please send me more, have you any more of those? So we'll move from the Natural History Museum now to the Brantwood years, and I guess most of you will be at least superficially familiar with the fact that he purchased Brantwood. When he bought it, the story is that he had not seen the house. The house was previously owned by W.J. Linton, who was a sort of a political activist and had been producing his own broadsheet. He then emigrated to the States, and he had done some serious botanical work in the Lake District. But anyway, the day came that he decided he was never going to come back to the UK. He no longer needed the property. And he wrote to Ruskin offering him the house. And there are a couple of versions of this. One was that they offered him the house, and the other is that he asked him, did he know anyone who might want to buy it? Anyway, Ruskin decided that he would buy it. The asking price was £1,500. The deal was done in the course of just a couple of letters, And it was interesting to actually track down the correspondence because, again, I found no record of that being a known fact, but it turns out that they're in the Beinecker Library at Yale University, and so I managed to get a transcript of that. But when he bought the house, it was pretty much a ruin. He was really quite surprised what a poor state it was in. And to a large extent, he bought the house because of the view. And as I put at the bottom here, he had moored his rowing boat there to do a sketch of the old man of Coniston when he was a young lad, 19. And so he knew where the house was, he recalled the view, and he thought he'd take a punt on it. Now, even to the greatest fan, Brantwood is not an architectural masterpiece. It's a small cottage which has been extended and extended and extended in all sorts of different styles. So here we have the famous window with the 7 pillars. Here we've got the more recent gallery, the 7 studio built for Arthur Seven. We've got the little turret on the corner of his bedroom, which was one of the early additions. And then we've got this octagonal room, which was done again by the Sevens later on. But it all fits together well enough, and its beautiful setting and its wonderful surroundings make it a really nice place to visit. The other thing that's perhaps interesting to mention, and I don't know how many people will have seen this map, it lives in the gardener's room. And it was only through quizzing Howard about the size of the estate and how that had changed over time that he said, oh, we'll go and have a look at the plan. And so the red line shows you the current extent of the Brantwood estate. The areas out with that were later additions and have subsequently been disposed of. So when he bought it, he thought he'd bought 15 acres. It turned out to be nearer 25. And over time, what you see on the map here grew to about 500 acres. And it's now back down to the lesser red boundary. Now, the heart of Brantwood, really, both now and in Ruskin's day, is the study. And I think that the Brantwood Trust have done a remarkable job in recreating this and reinstating it, and over a period of time managing to retrieve items that were sold during the auction sales. And most notably, in the current context, these 3 mineral cabinets, which are now back sat where they would have sat back in the 1900s before they were disposed of in the auction sales in the 1920s. And this bookcase is a fairly recent gift back that had also been specially constructed, had left Brantwood and has come back again. So John Ruskin has died. He had left express instructions with his executors and the Sevens that they should retain his collections, his medieval manuscripts, his paintings, his Turners, his books, his library, his mineral collections, his shells, and that they should open Brantwood to the public on a number of days a year. And he had provided funding through his sale of his publications in order to make that happen. History decided to take a different course, and as you will know, Joan and Arthur set about liquidating the assets, and they went out in all sorts of different sales, private treaty sales, auction sales, to various different people in all different directions. And in 1920, this guy on the right here, another major figure in the world of the Natural History Museum, Walter Campbell Smith, visited Brantwood. He spent from the 6th to the 9th of July 1920 working his way through the mineral collection, preparing a detailed inventory. Why that happened is open to conjecture. My guess is that the museum had been asked to send someone up to value the collection because the Sevens would have had no idea about the value. They may simply want to know, is it worth anything? Is it worth trying to sell it or not? Anyway, whatever the reason, he came up there and he produced a very detailed inventory. And so this survives, and very fortunately, through Campbell Smith's eyes and his detailed notes, we can get an appreciation of what remained at Brantwood in 1920. Significantly, Campbell Smith was a very close friend of Sir Arthur Russell. And so you don't have to have too much belief in the imagination that Smith must have tipped off Russell. So this is a couple of pages from Campbell Smith's notes, and you can see we've got draw numbers down the side, and he says 17 specimens, 8 specimens, 14 smaller crystals. Some of them have little sketches. This sketch was quite useful because I managed to find that specimen. It's a fluorite from the Alps. But I'll just put up here a typed version just so it's a bit easier for you to see. And you can see the detailed work that Campbell Smith went through. And here I've circled in red 3 particularly interesting draws. 21 specimens of native gold, mostly labelled, 20 further specimens of native gold, including 4 nuggets of about 8 ounces each. In today's money, that's about £25,000 each. Huh? And a fine specimen of leafy gold, and I think I know which one that is. That still survives. And then in drawer 17, 27 more specimens, mostly specimens of gold in quartz, cut and polished, including from North Wales. So you can immediately get a sense that there's some stuff of interest and value and financial value as well. So roll the clock on from 1920 to 1922, and Arthur Russell has arranged to visit Brantwood, and he stayed with Jones 7 in 1922. And in November the following year, 1923, he wrote to Jones 7 and asked could he go back to Brantwood to make a detailed assessment of the collection with a view to purchasing some of it. And this is her reply. Very welcoming. Your letter came just as we believe in Brantwood. I've since been too tired to write, but today told Mrs. Wilkinson, who will be in the house, the housekeeper, to keep a bed well aired for you in the turret room, a fire in the study, and with the key which I've left in the pincushion box in my bedroom for you, labelled for the mineral cabinets, and which please seal up again. When you are going to Brantwood, let Mrs. Miles Wilkinson Senior know when to expect you there, and write ordering Bain's Motor Garage of Coniston when and where to meet and take you here, also in returning, and put the bill down to us. Well, yeah, that's the sort of reply you want, isn't it? So Arthur didn't waste any time. He very quickly arranged to get a train ticket, and on the top of Jones' letter, he wrote, leave Saturday 17th, St Pancras 9:50, Coniston 6:20. So that was a long day for him, multiple changes on the way up through the rail network. He basically replicated exactly what Campbell Smith had done. His emphasis was perhaps slightly different because he was obviously looking at things he was interested in acquiring, whereas Campbell Smith was simply making a technical assessment. And he produced 25 pages of notes, and those survive as well in his archive at the Natural History Museum. And ultimately, he produced a 4-page summary for a total of £241, 13 shillings and sixpence. And of that, 50% was accounted for by gold specimens. Now, Sir Arthur Russell only collected British minerals, and hardly any of the gold was British. So he was buying this in order to resell it, and that was what he did generally with the collection. He was looking to buy things that he wanted to keep, but he also purchased stuff that he knew he could resell in order to finance his hobby. Because although he sounds very grand as Sir Arthur Russell, and he lived at a big stately home near Reading, Swallowfield, he really didn't have much money. He was sort of property rich and capital poor. And so here are some typical comments from Russell's notes. And he was very astute. He was thinking about what he was going to need for himself, what might be interesting for other collectors. He may even have had people in mind, and particularly he knew what the British Museum was likely to be interested in buying. So here's the centre of his folded in half sheet of Brantwood notepaper. You can just about see the embossing there, Brantwood, Coniston Lake, Lancashire. And these are his drawer numbers, a quick note of what's in them, and the price he was expecting to pay for those specimens. So let's have a look at some of the things that he acquired. He chose very well. So these are obviously all attractive specimens. We have a beryl on the left here, quite a sizable crystal, that's 9 centimeters tall. A rather nice ruby crystal, that's about an inch on edge. And a rather spectacular diamond. It's very unusual to have a flattened crystal like this. Generally, they're octahedrons. And this is, again, quite sizable. It's about 3 centimeters across. It's colorless and flawless, and really a very unusual thing. And this, I believe, is the fine leaf gold that Campbell Smith drew attention to. And this was purchased by Russell and then sold to the museum, and it survives today. And that sits just nicely in the palm of your hand, and it's notably heavy. It's just over 2 ounces. And because it's pure gold, it's very fragile and ductile. It will bend quite easily. And one of the things that becomes apparent when you start looking at Ruskin's mineral collection, is that he was looking at the aesthetics. Generally speaking, he was interested in colours and forms and shapes and textures and contrasts and so on. And so these are all different specimens of fluorite from different localities, but they're all visually striking as something that would please the eye. So at the Natural History Museum, London, in the Mineral Gallery, at the far end is the vault, and that is where some of these treasures are still exhibited today. And scattered through the various table cases and wall cases, there are also specimens from Ruskin's collection. And I've just put that in as just a sort of wow factor. These are some of the specimens which John Ruskin had in his collection and ultimately found their way to the Natural History Museum via Sir Arthur Russell. So the Edwards ruby, named after a famous military figure who was out in India. Um, this is a rather interesting specimen. This is a pebble from a conglomerate, and the cement that was sticking it to the next pebble is still there, forming a sort of crust. And we can see we have a diamond here and also specks of gold. So these diamonds and the old flakes have been moved by rivers, redeposited, buried, turned into a conglomerate, and then exhumed or washed away by a river. And this is John Ruskin's handwriting, diamonds in the matrix with native gold from Golconda in India. And there's a close-up of the diamond just to show you this detail. And the other thing that Ruskin got involved with was a silica exhibit. And this was really as a result of him being underwhelmed by the display that Fletcher was talking about putting on in the new Mineral Gallery. So this is the Mineral Gallery plan I just showed you the photo of. And at the Meteorite Pavilion, which is no longer there, this is now the vault, on the right here it says Silica Ruskin. And he put this display on in 1884, and as far as I can determine, it was still there in the 1920s. It might have made it into the 1930s. Quite remarkable. In the history of the museum, I think John Ruskin is the only person who's ever been allowed to stage his own exhibition and to print a catalogue of it and to offer it for sale in the museum. Quite an interesting side story. And if you're interested in looking at that in a little bit more detail, if you go to my website, just write down britishmineralogy.com, I've created a flip book of the specimens. I managed to trace about 100 out of the 130. It's been a huge task. And I've used his words, his original descriptions, with an illustration of the specimen. If you've got a mobile phone, you can just scan that QR code. It'll take you to the page. I'll just wait a second if anyone wants to do that. But yes, a really interesting story. And again, who knew that? I didn't. Another thing that's really striking is that back in the 1920s, the museum produced a series of colour printed postcards of things like mosses and plants and animals, dinosaurs, minerals, rocks, and gemstones. And the gemstone series includes a diamond, another diamond, the Edwards ruby, and the first ruby I showed you. All of those are John Ruskin specimens. So from the tens of thousands of mineral specimens and gemstones in the Natural History Museum, those 4 were considered good enough and worthy to be featured in the postcard series, and they all belonged to our man. Now, most interestingly, the Colenso diamond, which again is a very interesting story. I don't have the time this evening to go into it, but if you're interested, you can read about it. This is the famous watercolor by Collingwood. And this was a seriously large diamond. And when Ruskin purchased it, he was in shock when it was first sent on approval, and it was much bigger and hence much more expensive than he expected. And it's very fortunate that Collingwood actually painted this, and it's a pretty faithful representation of the stone because there's only one photograph of it and it's in black and white, and this is that. And the story of the diamond is that it was stolen. It was on display for 80 years or thereabouts in the Mineral Gallery, and one night someone climbed up a drain pipe, sawed through the iron bars, smashed the window, broke into the case and disappeared into the night. And it's a really interesting tale of intrigue and possibly of the miscarriage of justice, because the guy who got prosecuted and jailed may not have been the villain. And there's a private television company looking to make a series. They're called Colenso Films. So if you're interested in following that up, you can just Google them. And it's actually the nephew of the guy who was said to have stolen the diamond, who's making the film. So yeah, a very interesting story. So back to Brantwood, 1931. So Russell has been and gone, and he's had all the best stuff. He had the pick of the collection, basically. And so they're now moving into house clearance mode. So the sevens are long since gone. And there was a 3-day sale, which by all the written accounts was a bit of a disaster. The auctioneers decided to put stuff in the garden. We are in the Lake District, and it rained, and so it was rather chaotic. And there were 790 lots, and the one of particular interest to us is lot 94, which was described as a bookcase. But it's an odd bookcase because it included innumerable specimen drawers containing a large quantity of varied minerals, also catalogues with full descriptions of such minerals. But peculiarly, on the day of the sale, it had gone. And these were sold privately before the sale, and that caused some unrest, and there's some interesting records of discussion about that. And the mystery buyer turned out, well, it was thought to be a Hungarian, but it's actually not Hungarian, but he was the father of this lady here. So the mineral collection in his cabinets was purchased for Richard Lytton by his mother Eva, or possibly his stepfather George, who was Romanian, because he was generally interested in geology minerals. And this is Eva. This is a rather nice picture. This has come from Ian and Susie Bowers, who were the owners of the mineral collection that was taken from Brantwood and then returned to Brantwood. And so I think we owe this lady a big debt of thanks for taking custody of the collection when it was most likely it would have been disposed of, maybe even just thrown away. So here we have Joan Seven, Arthur Seven, and Eva. So to condense that very convoluted story, we now have the treasury at Brantwood. The collection had been at the southern end of the lake for all that time, and eventually circumstances changed. The people that owned it decided they'd like it to go back to Brantwood, and a deal was struck, resulting in the collection returning to Brantwood. With it came Ruskin's catalogue. I have to say that as a curator, he doesn't get many marks. Generally speaking, he didn't record localities, and that's pretty fundamental. But there was an earlier catalogue, and this was referred to by Campbell Smith. And this again was something that turned up as a result of the project. Nobody knew where this was. Possibly the people that have it knew where it was, but they didn't know anyone was interested. And it was actually buried in the library at the Natural History Museum in the archives. And so this was a very much more interesting document for several reasons, but particularly because the bulk of this related to the Stowe collection, the Duke of Buckingham's collection from Stowe House, now Stowe School. And it was prepared for a mineral dealer, James Tennant, by a chap called Davis, who was a sort of an officer at the Natural History Museum, but moonlighted with Tennant. And he prepared all the text on the right-hand page, and the left-hand facing pages were blank. And Ruskin decided he would make use of the left-hand pages to record all of his purchases from Richard Talling. And so we have a unique record of about 800 specimens and the prices paid for. These will be shillings. So it's a fascinating document. It's full of interesting work. Now, the other thing that commonly people look at when they're looking at historical collections of minerals is the labels and the numbers. And there are a bewildering variety of these. But what I can say is that these mitered irregular hexagonal labels, so they're rectangles with two corners chopped off, always the upper corners, these are original Ruskin numbers. The typeface and the size varies over time, but invariably he chopped the top corners off. My theory for that is to distinguish the way up for numbers like 81 and 18 and 66 and 99. If you've got other suggestions, I'd be interested to hear them. And you can see that these were pre-printed, sort of perforated to tell you where to cut them up. Some of these others I can recognize. These are Richard Talling printed labels. This is a Richard Talling handwritten label, generally indicating a more expensive, rarer specimen. And these two in the lower corner are from the Stowe collection, and there are quite a lot of those. And I mentioned right at the beginning, remember, on the Gwindle, this 35 over R type. And there's a little slip of paper tucked into the blue catalogue with the rest of these that he'd written out. So the collection today, there are 2,000 specimens back at Brantwood, and this is what it looks like. It was curated and cleaned by a commercial company, Crystal Classics. They made a very nice job of it. And just a selection of specimens from the Brantwood collection to give you some idea. There's a lot of very attractive looking stuff. Sadly, much of it doesn't have any curatorial data, no locality. We can make guesses about some of it. And if it's got a Stowe number on it, like this one, we can actually go and look that up in the Stowe catalogue. So I mentioned briefly earlier that he wasn't much of a field collector. These are the guys he was getting his specimens from. Richard Talling would be on there, but no photograph exists of Richard Talling, unfortunately. But Francis Henry Butler, a very leading figure in London, James Tennant, I've already mentioned, Bryce Wright, another major dealer in the era. And so these people would crate stuff up, they'd send it on approval by post or by train. Possibly they would meet periodically. And it's a typical Richard Talling invoice, and there's a few of these survive with gloriously detailed descriptions. And you can see that he had a number series that was unique to each customer. So at this point, he had submitted 1,670 specimens to Ruskin on approval. Ruskin would have rejected maybe a third or a half of them. And I can say with confidence there's about 800 recorded in his catalogues. And on the left here, I've put a letter. You won't be able to read this, but don't worry about that. But I wanted just to show you the diagram here. And in the case of Richard Talling and Francis Henry Butler in particular, Ruskin was using these people as his mentors and his educators, his consultants in the field of mineralogy. And so he would often write back with questions to say, can you tell me at all about number 289? And I'm not happy about this, and I want to know about that. And if crystal A and crystal B was whatever, then C and D, what's happening about the top? And he was always looking for more information, more detail, wanting to learn. And these things, there's a lot of scope for further research and historical study. If someone wants to pick it up, I don't know whether I will. I'll just put this in for a bit of fun. So we know that he had lots of crystals and minerals. I asked ChatGPT to draw me a picture of Ruskin out looking for minerals lost in the mist of time, and that's what it came up with. It's quite good fun to play with, if you like. So here we've got crystals, and he's clutching a copy of the Stones of Venice, and we've got some architecture in the background. So really, what began was a major paper chase and a detective story. And the inputs at the top here are the dealers that I've just mentioned. We've got the major input of the Stowe collection, the routes by which it came to him, and then from him out through Sir Arthur Russell, directly to the Natural History Museum, through Russell to people in the States, obviously to the St George's Museum in Walkley, the stuff that stayed at Brantwood, things he gave to Collingwood that went to the Ruskin Museum. So all over the place. And I've had a great deal of fun tracing these. And I'd just like to just give you a few snapshots to tell the story, though. This is the cottage at Walkley. Ultimately, the museum outgrew that and it moved to Mearsbrook Park. And this is probably a fairly well-known photograph of the mineral room at Mearsbrook. Just one of the many treasures, a rather remarkable piece of gemstone carving. There are 2,000 specimens in the care of the Guild at Sheffield. Ashley Gallant has been absolutely magnificent in granting me access and helping me to work there. He liked big specimens, he liked showy specimens. This is a remarkably good specimen of native silver. This too will be at Brantwood for the exhibition. He liked diamonds, the bigger the better. So the biggest one of these is about 7 millimeters, quite nice diamond crystals. Now this is a topaz, it's 200 millimeters tall, and the story with this is that he was looking at it in a shop, the lady that was showing him dropped it and it broke, and reportedly he immediately stepped forward and said, I'll buy it at the price you were going to ask me for it before it was broken. So what a good chap. And again, some striking specimens from the Guild collection. This is probably the finest specimen in the entire collection. That's getting on for a foot across, and this topaz crystal is about a 2-inch cube. A magnificent specimen indeed. In the Lake District, specimens found their way to the Ruskin Museum, and a shout out for Tracy Hodgson, the director there, who's also been huge help to me in the project. And very nice little gallery display. There's more to see behind the scenes and quite an interesting archive. Again, you'll see visually striking specimens. He did like to saw and polish his minerals, and in fact, he was quite proud of that. And made a bit of a thing that other people might not cut their specimens up, but I do. And then what I characterize as satellite collections. So these were things that were put together for educational institutions in the main. So St David's School in Reigate, that survives intact. It's now owned by an architectural foundation. Christ Hospital School at Horsham. Back in Ruskin's day, it was in London. It moved out to Sussex later on. Harrow School, they were quite surprised when I turned up and said, have you got any Ruskin specimens? They didn't know. And Somerville College at Oxford has two little gold nuggets, this rather fine piece of opal, which will be coming up to Brantwood, as will this piece of jewellery. And this is another interesting side story. Very briefly, he presented these sapphires to Somerville College as a gift because he wanted to endow the ladies' colleges. He was keen for the education of women. And then after a while, he had to write back somewhat sheepishly and say, "Can I have them back? Because I don't actually own them. I haven't paid for them. But I will get you some another day." And he duly did. And this time he sent the receipt to the principal of the college to show that he'd paid £100 for a case of sapphires. And more recently, they've been actually made into a piece of jewellery, which is called the Principal's Regalia. So before I wrap up, I would just like to say a big thank you. If you look in the book, you'll find about 200 names of individuals and organisations. I've scoured the planet in pursuit of information and specimens. Particular thanks to the Natural History Museum team here, Robin, Mike and Nadine, and also the people behind the scenes in the library, and for giving me permission to photograph and publish images. In the Ruskin world, Howard, of course, at Brantwood, and Tracy at the Ruskin Museum, Ashley in the Guild of St George collection at Sheffield. And I'm also enormously grateful to several Ruskin scholars. I am not a Ruskin scholar, I hasten to add, but Stuart Eagles, Mark Frost, Marcus Waite, and the late Clive Wilmer have all been helpful, and many others too numerous to mention. And of course, Lancaster, I was able to get some access to, even though it has been closed for the entire duration of the project. So, as most authors do, I will apologise for saying there is a book. If you're interested, that's what it looks like. It's quite a reasonable size. Those are the thickness. They are available at Brantwood. You can order one via the website. Just go to britishmineralogy.com. Shipping price included in yellow. It is actually quite an interesting read, and I think it adds some useful information to the literature of John Ruskin. And finally, as mentioned at the outset, this is off the website for Brantwood. There'll be a special exhibition debuting on the 3rd of July through to the 25th of October. That will have some very interesting items that have not been to Brantwood before. So if you can get yourself up to the Lake District, I would recommend that you do so. So I think that's 1 hour, Simon. I will stop sharing.
Roy, absolutely. Your timing, I have to say, I'm going to use this forever as an exemplar to all future speakers that it is possible to bring a talk in exactly on time. Thank you. That was, as there's a rather nice note from Stuart Eagles in the chat.
Okay, let's open those up.
Thank you for an exemplary talk, truly packed full of gems. Very appropriate phrase.
Right.
Completely gripping and full of insight. And what's so lovely is that your passion for both the detective nature of the story you've sort of uncovered and pieced together, and finding things in places where they didn't even know they had things that were of Ruskinian interest is fascinating.
Yeah.
Really wonderful. And I can't decide whether I feel murderous about the Sevens and their or whether they simply, needed money and at the end of their lives. But the story of the sales is so depressing. But anyway, that's just a personal thought. I want to open it up to any questions. Jeff, you've got your hand up, your metaphorical hand up. So if you want to unmute, do ask a question.
And yes, like Stuart, I found that really interesting, and thank you very much for that talk. The, my reaction, though, one of the reactions I had was I was a bit disappointed in to find out that Ruskin didn't collect these minerals himself. I'd always kind of naively assumed that he probably did, going off on these trips to the Alps and so on, coming back with um, cases full of minerals that he collected. Didn't he collect anything himself on these trips, or not?
Well, he did collect some things. If you look in the treasury, have you been to Brantwood since the treasury opened?
Probably not.
No.
No.
There are a few specimens in the cases there, and they're generally rocks rather than minerals, so geological specimens. And I think those are probably things that he picked up. And there are some notes in his diaries. I've been through every page of his diaries that I could access anywhere. And he says, I rode across the lake and visited the old mine and so on. But to be honest, most of what he picked up was probably really not worth keeping. And he did collect in the Alps, but again, they were mostly rocks rather than minerals. So the distinction being, if you think of a fruit cake as being a rock, it's made up of raisins and currants and cherries. That's the raisins and currants and cherries are the minerals. So they're discrete chemical phases, and you add bits of minerals together to make a rock. So there's nothing wrong with him collecting bits of rock. They're just not very pretty mostly. And I think the other thing I didn't allude to it at the beginning, and you all know this anyway, but for the sake of the recording, he inherited about 19 million pounds from his dad. It does help, if you want to be a collector, then once people know you're interested, they will pander to your desires. Yeah. And so Bryce Wright, and he was always complaining about the prices. He complained to Talling about his poor packaging. Why do you send me these crumbly, flaky minerals? Don't send me things that I must think half an hour before I pick it up, and so on. Beautiful turn of phrase. And I've actually transcribed quite a lot of letters that have never been published before because I thought it was so interesting. But no, he wasn't a great field collector, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Francis.
Francis.
Roy, thank you so much. Now, Ruskin obviously loved his rocks and minerals and the aesthetics, the colours, the shapes, and was an amazing collector. Did his collections in their various places actually add to the sort of scientific understanding of geology? Did it advance the science of geology directly or indirectly?
Yeah. Well, I would say indirectly, yes, because he was out there to educate people. He wanted mineralogy and geology to be like botany and biology. So in terms of the national curriculum, as we think of it now, he wanted them to be subjects that people learnt about, taught about, understood. He really wasn't a scientist, and I don't want to do him down. I talked to Stuart Eagles about this at some length because he said, well, you have to come down one side of the fence or the other. And I said, well, okay, well, the reality is no. He didn't really produce any major science. One of the things that he did do was publish a series of papers in the Geological magazine, which again, it was a real eureka moment for me. I thought, gosh, so this is a learned society, and he was publishing papers on agates, but they're very descriptive. They're not technical, and he did offer ideas and theories, but they were not grounded in any real substance. So no, I think his contribution is that he's left us a lot of nice specimens, many of whom are still traceable, but not really in scientific thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask?
Yeah.
So in one of the early slides, you had that diagram of the Swiss roll, kind of.
Yes. Yeah.
Are there many other visual diagrams? Sort of,
yes, if you look into
investigate
in Deucalion, there are quite a few sketches. Yeah. And for his agate papers, again, another thing, there are so many angles you can go into. The engravings that were produced for these publications are just astonishing. When you think that Collingwood was doing this back to front, on a piece of wood or on a piece of metal, and when you look at some of these agates, and you can match the drawing, the printed plate, to the actual object, you're going to say, yeah, that's the same piece. In remarkable detail. They're not photographic copies, but they would pick out the obvious things. So for example, if we're looking at Peter and Ross there, we could draw two figures, and he would pick out the chairs, and you get the chairs, and you'd match it, and you'd get a sense that they're sitting in a room with a window at the back. And so the woodcuts and the metal engravings are very much of that sort of nature. And I'm just in awe of the stuff that all these guys could do.
Well, thank you very much for an incredible talk.
Thank you.
I'll definitely go and look at more of the drawings.
Yeah. The other thing I didn't really say, but it really surprises me that when you look at people like Tim Hilton, his major biographer, the word mineral doesn't appear in the index. He's got Mineralogical Society, which is a bit of a misnomer because he was never actually a member of that. And the other one, the wider sea, Yeah, these guys all say, oh, he was interested in minerals and move on. And people have been doing this for 100 years. So it was really nice to find it as a bit of virgin territory where hopefully I've added a bit of value. Yeah.
It's one of the things, I mean, you didn't quite use this word, I don't think, but one of the things that struck me was the sense in two senses of them providing a real sense of constancy in his life. First of all, it's his earliest interest, geology.
Yeah.
So that sense that throughout his life he can sort of think back to childhood and his, beginnings of this extraordinary life. Then also constancy in the sense of these things that are sort of stable when so much of his life was unstable.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if they arrived, they've been badly packaged,
yes.
weren't stable enough. But
yeah,
there's objects really struck by them as sort of things that he could rely on as his mind became less reliable.
Yes.
They were present in a very particular way.
Yeah. Yeah, that really came out. I basically transcribed anything that related to minerals out of the library edition and diaries and put them all into an Excel spreadsheet chronologically. And it became very clear that he kept going back to minerals, and particularly in the diaries, he quite often says, I was up early at minerals or something like that. That was really, touchstone is a bit of a pun, but it was very much his touchstone, I think. Yeah.
Can I ask just one other thing? So, like you were saying that he wasn't collecting the minerals himself; he was buying through dealers. But is there anything that might relate to a sort of a mapping interest in terms of where the minerals were actually from? Because I'm thinking, I'm just thinking of like the first geological maps, and the fact that the UK has got such a wide range of geological offering.
Yeah. No, there's a very definite answer to that. The answer is no. Sadly, he's on record in print in the catalogue of the collection he gave to the Museum of Kirkcudbrightshire in southern Scotland on the Solway's Firth. He says, I do not much care for noting where my specimens come from unless there is a particular reason to do so.
Oh.
And he was an utterly terrible curator, really, from that point of view. Yeah. But he wasn't really bothered. He was interested in the colour and the form and the shape, and whether he liked it or not.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Which is a shame, because it substantially devalues the collection that survives, because without a locality, it's just a rock. Yeah.
But maybe he was interested in sort of extending the rock in terms of its aesthetics value, and that could be seen as just as important.
Oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with collecting minerals because they're pretty things. Plenty of people do that today. Yeah.
Peter and Ross, you have a hand up.
Indeed. So anyway, very nice to have attention drawn to our chairs, which are very fine. Pure arts and crafts. So I want to say two things. One is that living in Scotland as we do, Ross and I have made a habit of dropping in at Brantford whenever we're going from south to north or from north to south. And on one of those occasions, I suppose it must be about 3 years ago, but I don't really know. But Howard always somehow gets to know that we're there. And he came rushing into the room where we were and said, come and see the mineral collection. And it's just arrived. And he was sort of flicking a duster around and opened a few drawers for us and so on. So we shared the excitement of it. Then I want to say a very warm thank you to you, Roy. I have a sort of mental block about anything vaguely scientific. That's my excuse anyway. But what I've found in life is that when I find a book difficult, written by a living author, well, after I've heard a talk, and I've heard a great many talks in my life, like we all have, I somehow tune into the rhythm of that writer. So I think you've given me an open doorway into your book, and we're very proud of having a copy, and now I shall try to read it. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Okay.
Any other questions or reflections?
How long would the exhibition actually be at Brantwood for?
From the 3rd of July until the 25th of October, I think.
Thank you.
Mm.
And will it have its own, if not a full catalogue, will it have a kind of listing of all the, given there are
Yeah,
loads from...
I've not seen it yet. Howard is producing, I think it's probably going to be like a big sheet of paper folded into 8 or something like that. But there will
Okay,
be a guide. Yeah. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And this will be in the blue gallery, the high security room with the steel door and stuff.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, it should be interesting.
Wonderful.
did Ruskin have a favourite specimen? One he kept going back to, referring, cradling?
I've not really got any evidence to say that. He did like diamonds. There's no doubt about diamonds. I forgot to hold this up. I will do so now. The Colenso diamond was a really significant diamond, and for many years it was the largest diamond in the British Museum, and that's how big it is.
Wow.
Right? That's a 3D printed model. I don't know why that's not working particularly well, but yeah, it's because I've got a background on. But yeah, it's a fantastic item.
Mm.
Probably it was shipped straight overseas to Belgium or Amsterdam or something like that and cut up. It's just not known. But do keep an eye out for Colenso films. It's a really interesting story. And back in the 1970s, World in Action actually made a half-hour program, basically putting the pitch to the Home Secretary that this was a miscarriage of justice and this guy couldn't have stolen the diamond. And they had a really top-class cast of actors rereading the words from the trial, including Nigel Hawthorne from Yes Minister. So I actually I had to pay to have it moved from tape to digital format so I could watch it. But I thought I really needed to see that program, and it's a 30-minute, really interesting story. Yeah.
Mm. Lovely. Well, nice to end on an unsolved
Yeah.
mystery. But
Yeah.
yes, wonderful if that film comes. Roy, can I say on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for this evening. Really fascinating, compelling, and thing tale that you've shared. Really enormously grateful. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure, and thank you for coming. Okay.